She stood among the sea of people, her shoulders hunched and her uniform hidden beneath a plain shawl, her presence almost invisible against the throng that had gathered in the dusty square. The general's speech echoed through the air, his voice carried on speakers mounted high, each word meant to inspire loyalty and obedience, but for her it only stirred a storm she had been holding back for years. The crowd cheered at his promises, raised banners at his slogans, their voices blending into a roar that masked the quiet fury in her chest, yet she kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the platform where he stood in his polished boots and glittering medals. No one noticed her, no one ever did, and she had long since accepted that invisibility was her greatest weapon. She had been a soldier once, not in the parades they showed on the screens, but in the shadows where orders were whispered and missions ended with blood on cold stone floors. Her name had never been spoken in the news, her face never printed on the posters that praised the so-called heroes, but her scars bore witness to 100 forgotten battles. She had bled for the same flag the general now waved, and she had watched her comrades fall nameless into shallow graves while he climbed ranks and collected honors for victories he had never earned. Every cheer from the crowd was a knife in her heart, a reminder of how the truth had been buried beneath his lies, but she did not flinch, for she had carried heavier weights in silence. Her hands, rough from years of gripping weapons, trembled only slightly as she brushed the fabric at her side, feeling the cold metal hidden beneath, a weapon she had smuggled past the soldiers who searched lazily at the gate, never suspecting that a weary woman with tired eyes could pose any threat. She remembered her days in the regiment, the endless marches through mud, the sting of hunger gnawing at their bellies, the desperate looks of her sisters in arms who held on to courage even when hope had been stripped away, and she remembered the moment when they were abandoned, cut off without supplies, left to die in the wilderness because the general deemed them expendable. Out of 40, only 7 survived, crawling back with broken bones and hollow faces, and when they reached the base, they were not met with honor but silence, their suffering dismissed as incompetence, their dead forgotten. She had carried the weight of those lost lives ever since, each one a shadow walking beside her, whispering for justice. And now justice stood on that platform, wrapped in gold and arrogance, his chest puffed out as he saluted the people who had never seen the mud, the blood, the betrayal. She lifted her eyes for the first time, her gaze sharp as a blade, and in that instant the noise of the square seemed to fade, as though the world held its breath with her. Her heart pounded like war drums, not with fear but with a steady rhythm of resolve, the same rhythm that had kept her alive when death pressed close. She thought of Mira, the youngest in their unit, who laughed even in the darkest nights until a single bullet silenced her forever. She thought of Alara, who swore she would return to her children but never did. She thought of all of them, and she whispered their names silently like a prayer, letting the weight of their memory steady her hand. The general raised his fist, the crowd erupted, and in that moment she moved. Her hand slipped beneath the shawl, fingers curling around the weapon's grip, the familiar feel awakening something buried deep within her, the soldier who had been forced into silence for far too long. She drew it out slowly, each second stretching into eternity, her movements hidden by the bodies pressing around her, and as she raised the weapon, her eyes locked on his with a clarity that cut through distance and noise. He had never seen her before, never noticed the faces of those he condemned, but in that instant, as her figure emerged from the faceless crowd, his gaze faltered, his words stuttered, and for the first time the mask of certainty cracked. She did not speak, for there was nothing left to say. Her shot would be her voice, her justice, her truth. And as the trigger tightened beneath her finger, time seemed to collapse, the years of silence, pain, and betrayal converging into a single breath, a single heartbeat, a single moment that would leave the general speechless. The shot cracked like thunder through the square, shattering the chants into stunned silence, the echo bouncing off stone walls and iron beams, a sound that tore through the banners and speeches and drilled itself into every ear, and for one frozen instant the world stood still. The general staggered, his voice cut short mid-sentence, his polished boots scuffing against the wooden platform as the echo of the bullet lingered, and a gasp rose from the crowd like a single sharp intake of breath, disbelief flooding the air heavier than smoke. She held her stance, her arms steady, her eyes locked not on his wound but on his face, the mask of confidence now twisted with shock, his mouth opening as if to roar commands but no sound coming out, his power crumbling with every second he remained speechless. The soldiers on the stage rushed forward, their rifles clattering, their eyes scanning wildly across the crowd, but she was already moving, weaving back into the sea of bodies, the shawl wrapped tightly, her form swallowed by the panic that erupted like wildfire. People screamed, pushing and shoving, some dropping to the ground, others running in all directions, and in that chaos she vanished, a shadow dissolving among shadows, her heart steady even as the square turned into a storm. She did not run blindly, for she had learned in war that panic was death. She slipped through alleys, ducked under abandoned stalls, moved with the precision of someone who knew every corner of the city, every escape route carved from years of survival. Behind her the sirens wailed, orders barked over loudspeakers, boots pounded against the stones, but she did not look back, not once, because looking back was for those who doubted, and she had already chosen her path. Her hands still tingled from the shot, her ears still rang with its echo, but her mind was clear, sharper than it had been in years, and though she knew the consequences waiting for her, she felt no regret, only the weight of justice settling lightly on her shoulders. She thought of the faces of the fallen again, but this time they did not whisper sorrow. They stood taller in her memory, their silence now joined with hers, a chorus of unseen voices that had finally spoken through her action. Yet the mission was not done, for she knew the general was not dead, not yet. The bullet had struck but not ended, and in that unfinished truth lay the danger, because a wounded tyrant was more dangerous than a victorious one, and he would unleash fury like fire upon the people to hide his weakness. She reached the edge of the square, slipping through a half-broken gate into the narrow backstreets where shadows stretched long, and there she slowed, breathing deep, her body aching with exhaustion she dared not show. Her hand brushed against the cold bricks, grounding herself, reminding her that she was still alive, still unseen, and she whispered once more the names of her sisters, as if to promise them she would not stop until it was done. The city's heartbeat pounded around her, sirens blaring, boots marching, the metallic growl of armored vehicles rolling into the streets, and she realized her shot had done more than wound the general. It had ripped open the illusion of control he had held, exposed his vulnerability to the world, and the people who had once cheered now trembled not just from fear but from the spark of something long buried, doubt. In that doubt lay the seed of rebellion, and she knew seeds, once planted, could grow stronger than chains. But she also knew seeds needed water, needed care, needed someone willing to sacrifice to keep them alive, and as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows she accepted that she had become that someone, not by choice but by necessity. Her invisibility, once her curse, had become her shield, for no one in the crowd had seen her face clearly, no one had memorized her features, and in the storm of chaos she was already a ghost, a rumor that would spread with every retelling. The soldiers would hunt, the city would tighten and walls would close in, but she had lived through worse, survived nights where death breathed on her neck, and she would do so again. She pulled the weapon close to her chest, wiped it clean with the edge of her shawl, and tucked it away into the hidden pouch sewn long ago for such moments, then straightened her back, forcing the exhaustion from her limbs, because the mission was only beginning. Somewhere in the heart of the city the general would be rushed to safety, doctors scrambling, soldiers swarming, and already the state's propaganda would twist the story, painting her as a faceless enemy, a coward who dared strike in the shadows. But no words, no posters, no lies could erase the truth that the people had seen with their own eyes. Their untouchable leader had bled. She smiled faintly at that thought, not with joy but with grim certainty, for blood had power, and once shed it could not be hidden. She would need to move quickly now, to reach the safe house where old comrades might still linger, men and women forgotten by history but not broken, those who had carried the same scars and whispered the same names of the dead in the dark. They had once sworn to stand together if the chance ever came, and perhaps her shot had been that signal, the silent call to arms they had been waiting for all these years. She did not know if they still believed, if time had dulled their resolve or if life had buried them in fear, but she would find out because she could not fight alone, not against the machine that the general commanded. The streets around her grew narrower, darker, the noise of the square fading behind her, replaced by the dripping of water from rusted pipes and the scuttle of rats in the alleys, and with each step she sank deeper into the underbelly of the city, the place where the forgotten survived. Her body longed to rest, to collapse against the wall and let the weight of years and choices crush her, but she would not give in, not yet, for she carried more than her own life now. She carried the memory of all those whose names she whispered, and until justice was complete, she would not lay down her weapon. Somewhere above, the sky darkened with the first clouds of the evening, their heavy silence pressing down on the city like a warning, and she lifted her face toward them, her eyes hard but her lips whispering a prayer not for herself but for the courage to finish what she had begun. The world had seen her shot, but the war was only beginning. The safe house was nothing more than a crumbling apartment buried deep in the forgotten quarter of the city, its windows sealed with boards, its doors scarred by years of weather and neglect. Yet to her it felt like a fortress because of the memories it held, because behind those walls she had once laughed with comrades, shared stolen meals, patched wounds with trembling hands, and whispered promises of survival when the outside world seemed determined to erase them. She slipped through the alley, tapped the coded rhythm on the rusted metal door, and waited with her breath caught in her chest, half fearing that no one would answer, half fearing that someone would. Seconds stretched like hours until the door creaked open just enough for a sliver of light to cut the darkness, and a voice roughened by time whispered her name, a sound she had not heard in years but that struck her heart like the embrace of family. It was Rian, older now, his face lined and weary, but his eyes still burning with that same fire she remembered from the battlefield, the fire of someone who had seen everything taken yet still refused to surrender. He pulled her inside quickly, bolting the door, and the air inside wrapped around her with the scent of old wood, oil and dust, a smell that belonged to forgotten soldiers and the lives they carried in silence. There were 3 others in the room, faces she recognized immediately though the years had changed them. Leora, her arm missing from the last ambush yet her spirit as fierce as ever, Kale, the quiet sniper whose silence spoke louder than words, and Senna, the medic who had saved more lives than anyone, her hands trembling now but still steady when it mattered. They stared at her with a mixture of shock and relief, as though a ghost had walked through their door, and for a long moment none of them spoke, only the hum of the city outside filling the silence. Then Rian broke it with a low chuckle that carried both sorrow and pride, telling her he had seen the commotion on the broadcast, that he had seen the general falter, and though the cameras had cut away quickly, he knew in his bones it was her, for no one else carried the resolve to strike where no one else dared. She lowered her shawl, let them see her face, and in that moment the years of separation dissolved, for their eyes met in silent understanding of what had been lost and what still had to be done. They did not celebrate for they knew better than to cheer too soon, but the air shifted with a new weight, the weight of possibility, the weight of a mission rekindled. She told them everything, how she had waited in the crowd, how she had aimed, how she had seen the general's eyes crack with fear for the first time, and how she had slipped away unseen. Their silence was not disbelief but respect, for they understood the cost of such an act, the danger it carried not only for her but for anyone who had ever stood beside her, and they accepted that by opening the door to her they had chosen to share in that danger. Leora's voice cut the quiet, sharp and steady, reminding them all that the general would not let this go unanswered, that the city would drown in searches, arrests and fear until the shooter was found, and that whether they liked it or not, they were now part of the storm. Kale nodded once, his fingers tapping the barrel of the rifle that still lay polished in the corner despite the years of dust, a silent promise that his aim was still true. Senna whispered a prayer for strength, her hands folded tightly as though clinging to faith in something greater than themselves, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of someone who had already carried too much. Rian turned to her then, his voice low but certain, and asked the question that burned in all their minds, was the general still alive and what came next? She did not hesitate, did not soften the truth for she knew they deserved nothing less, and she told them the general lived, wounded but alive, and that meant their task was not finished, their justice not complete. The room sank into silence again, but this time it was not hesitation that held them but the weight of decision, the realization that they had been given one chance by fate, and if they turned away now, everything they had endured would remain in shadows. Slowly, one by one, they nodded, not with enthusiasm but with the grim determination of soldiers who had lost too much to ever walk away. Plans began to form, whispered in the dim light, maps unfolded from memory, old contacts recalled, routes considered, all of it done with the precision of people who had lived their lives preparing for moments just like this. She listened, contributed, her mind sharp though her body ached, and she felt once again the pulse of unity that had kept them alive so many years ago, the bond forged not by choice but by shared blood and sacrifice. Outside the city roared with sirens, screens blared with the general's trembling words declaring that the cowardly attack would not break him, that order would be restored, that loyalty would be tested, but she knew those words were cracks filled with fear, because behind his strong voice had been the image of his faltering steps, and the people had seen it too. As night deepened, they prepared what little they had, rifles cleaned, ammunition counted, disguises laid out, and though their supplies were pitiful, their resolve filled the room like fire, a fire that would burn brighter than the lies choking the city. She sat in the corner for a moment, her hand tracing the cold steel of her weapon, her mind wandering to the faces of the fallen once more, but this time she did not whisper their names as a prayer of sorrow. She spoke them in silence as if introducing them to her living comrades, as if bringing them into the circle, reminding everyone that they were never truly alone. For the first time in years she allowed herself a small breath of hope, fragile but real, the hope that perhaps the unseen could be seen, that perhaps justice could rise from the shadows. And though she knew the path ahead would demand more blood, more sacrifice, she steeled herself with the knowledge that they had already begun, and once begun there was no turning back. The night stretched heavy over the city, its streets crawling with soldiers, armored trucks rolling through avenues, checkpoints erected at every corner, and giant screens flashing the general's face, pale but defiant. His voice commanding loyalty while his eyes betrayed the unease of a man who had felt death's breath too close. Yet in the safe house, hidden beneath layers of darkness and silence, she and her comrades sat together, their whispers weaving plans as the world outside hunted blindly. Sleep was a luxury they could not afford, not while the city convulsed with suspicion, so instead they sharpened their minds, sketched routes through memory, and prepared themselves for what had to come next, each movement deliberate, each decision soaked in the weight of consequence. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, the scrape of steel against stone as Cale adjusted the old rifle, the quiet rustle of Leora's one hand tying knots with practiced ease, and the hushed murmurs of Senna as she inventoried what little medical supplies remained in her faded satchel, every sound a reminder that though they were few, they were not broken. She watched them closely, her heart tight with a strange mix of sorrow and strength, for she knew they should not have had to fight again, that their bones had already carried too much. Yet here they were, bound not by glory or promise but by a loyalty deeper than life itself, a loyalty to one another, to the fallen, to the truth that still lingered like a spark beneath the ash. Rian leaned forward, his eyes shadowed yet fierce, and spread a worn piece of cloth on the table, its surface marked with lines and symbols drawn long ago during their missions, half faded but still etched in their memories, a map not of streets but of possibilities, of hidden tunnels, abandoned routes, forgotten rooftops. He pointed toward the central compound, the fortress where the general now likely lay guarded by walls of steel and bodies of men who would die at his command, and his voice, low and steady, asked if they were ready to step into fire once more. No one spoke immediately, the silence stretching, filled with the unspoken memories of nights where missions ended in blood and days where comrades did not return, but slowly she lifted her chin, her voice calm but unwavering, saying they had already begun the war the moment she pulled the trigger, and now there was no road backward, only forward through fire. Her words lit the others like a spark, not with cheer but with grim acceptance, and they each nodded, their eyes locking on hers, the unspoken vow passing between them that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Outside, the city's heartbeat thundered with sirens and armored engines, but within the safe house, a different rhythm grew, the rhythm of resolve, of a plan forming, of unseen soldiers rising once again. They divided roles with precision born of habit. Cale would find the vantage, his eye still as sharp as in the days when his bullets had turned battles. Leora would handle explosives, her one hand working faster than most with two. Senna would be the anchor, ready to patch wounds, ready to keep breath in failing lungs. And Rian, ever the strategist, would guide them through the maze of alleys and shadows. As for her, she would finish what she had begun, for her shot had been the first crack, and it would be her hand that delivered the blow to break the illusion entirely. Hours bled into one another, the darkness outside softening into the faint gray of dawn, and with it came the sound of the city waking not with peace but with fear, the people shuffling beneath the eyes of soldiers, their conversations hushed, their movements watched, the tension hanging like smoke. She stood at the boarded window for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the distant skyline, the banners flapping with forced pride, the patrols moving like ants, and she felt the weight of history pressing down, the knowledge that every step she would take now was not only for the fallen but for those who still breathed under chains. She thought of Myra's laugh, of Alara's promise, of all the names she carried, and she whispered them again, each one a step forward, each one a breath of strength. When the time came, they moved quietly, slipping through the alleys like shadows, their figures merging with the morning fog, their hearts steady despite the danger that licked at their heels. The city seemed alive with eyes, every corner watched, every street patrolled, but they had lived invisible for years, and invisibility was a weapon sharper than steel. Cale led them to an old bell tower, long abandoned, its steps crumbling but its height offering the perfect view of the compound, and there he set himself, his rifle resting steady, his eye peering through the scope with the patience of a predator. Leora moved with Senna to set charges along the outer routes, not to destroy but to distract, to fracture the soldiers' control when the moment came, and Rian stayed by her side, whispering directions, guiding her through the labyrinth toward the place where she would take her final shot. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, each second stretching into eternity, each sound amplified, the distant bark of orders, the clatter of boots, the hum of engines. She crouched in the shadows, her weapon cradled against her chest, her breath slow, her pulse steady, and in her mind she returned once more to the battlefield of old, where chaos reigned but focus meant survival. She could almost hear the voices of her sisters beside her, urging her onward, and she let their memory sharpen her resolve. The compound loomed before them, its walls towering, its gates bristling with guards, and within those walls lay the man whose blood had already been spilled, the man whose voice had trembled on the stage though he tried to hide it, the man who had built his power on the bones of the forgotten. She had faced death before and she knew she might not walk away this time, but the thought did not shake her. It only hardened her because justice was worth more than breath. As the signal flare from Leora's charges split the sky with fire, the city erupted with noise, soldiers scattering, orders shouted, chaos blooming like thunder, and in that storm she moved, unseen, unstoppable, a soldier once more stepping into the fire that had always awaited her. The blast rolled through the city like a roar of awakening, smoke curling into the sky as fire licked the air, the distraction pulling soldiers from their posts, their formations breaking as confusion spread through their ranks, and in that crack of order she and Rian slipped closer to the compound, their bodies pressed against cold stone, moving from shadow to shadow with the precision of ghosts, their breaths shallow but steady, every step calculated because one wrong move would mean death. Cale's shot rang out from the bell tower, sharp and exact, the crack of his rifle echoing across rooftops, striking down the officer who had tried to rally the guards, and with that single bullet the fragile mask of control shattered further, soldiers ducking, shouting, firing blindly into streets where no enemy stood, their fear more dangerous than any plan. She gripped her weapon tighter, her palms slick with sweat, not from hesitation but from the raw knowledge that this was it, the moment where everything could end or everything could begin anew, and she steeled herself by whispering once more the names of her fallen sisters, each name grounding her, each name a reminder that her blood was not only her own. Rian's hand brushed her shoulder, his eyes signaling forward, and together they darted across the last stretch of open ground, the shouts of soldiers rising around them but never landing on their hidden forms, until they pressed themselves against the towering wall of the compound, its stone cold and rough beneath their fingers, its height meant to intimidate, its gates meant to keep power locked inside. She glanced up, gauging the climb, her muscles tensing with the memory of training drills long ago, her body remembering movements even if her bones ached with age, and without a word she began, pulling herself upward, her fingers finding holds in the cracks, her body rising with determination as Rian followed close behind. The world below blurred, the chaos of fire and gunshots fading into the background, until at last they reached the ledge, pulling themselves over and rolling silently into the shadows of the courtyard, their breaths heavy but controlled. The compound was alive with panic, soldiers rushing in all directions, medics sprinting toward the inner chambers where the general was hidden, the air thick with the metallic taste of fear, and she crouched low, her eyes narrowing on the grand hall at the center, its doors guarded, its windows glowing with dim light. That was where he would be, clinging to life, clinging to power, and that was where she had to go. Rian leaned close, whispering that Cale and Leora's diversions wouldn't hold forever, that they had only minutes before the compound locked down, and she nodded once, her resolve sharp as steel, then moved forward, every step deliberate, her weapon steady, her heart beating with the rhythm of inevitability. They slipped through the shadows, weaving between crates and wagons, blending with the movement of chaos, and as they drew closer she felt the weight of years pressing on her, all the memories of mud, blood, and betrayal converging into this single corridor, this single breath, this single chance. 2 guards blocked the side entrance, their rifles ready, their eyes scanning the darkness. But before they could notice, Rian struck from behind, swift and silent, his blade finding its mark, and she pulled their bodies into the shadows, her face expressionless, her heart unmoved, for death had long since become part of her language. Inside the hall, the air shifted, heavy with the stench of medicine and fear, the faint groans of the wounded leader echoing through the grand chamber where banners still hung, their colors mocking the truth of what had been lost. She crept forward, each step echoing in her bones, and when she finally saw him lying propped against cushions, his chest bandaged, his face pale, she felt no triumph, only the cold steadiness of justice long overdue. His eyes flicked up, and for the first time recognition sparked there, not of her face, for he had never noticed her among the countless he discarded, but of what she represented, the unseen, the forgotten, the betrayed, all of them standing through her. His lips moved, trembling, perhaps to command, perhaps to beg, but no sound strong enough emerged, only a rasp that fell weak against the weight of her silence. She raised her weapon slowly, deliberately, her gaze never leaving his, and for a moment the entire world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the tyrant and the unseen soldier, the betrayer and the betrayed, power and justice colliding in one heartbeat. Behind her, Rian stood watch, his body tense, his eyes scanning for threats, but he did not interfere, for he knew this moment belonged only to her, and she let it stretch, let the truth of it settle on his trembling frame, let him understand fully that it was not glory, not ambition, but justice that had come for him. Her finger curled against the trigger, steady as stone, her breath even, and in that instant she thought again of Myra's laughter, Ilara's promise, all the names whispered in the dark, and she gave them voice through her silence, through her action, through the inevitability of what was about to happen. And then the world erupted, not from her shot but from the sudden crash of doors as soldiers stormed the chamber, their shouts filling the air, their rifles raised, their eyes locking on the two intruders. Time fractured, every second stretching, the decision before her sharpened by chaos, and she knew this was it. The point of no return, the line she had always known she would cross. Her finger pressed down, the shot rang out, louder than all the shouts, louder than the chaos, and the general's body jerked back, his eyes wide in final disbelief, the silence of death falling over his lips, and in that heartbeat she felt the weight lift, the voices of the fallen quieting as though finally at rest. Rian fired into the soldiers as they charged, his movements swift, his aim ruthless, and together they moved like the soldiers they had once been, carving through chaos with the precision of those who had nothing left to lose. But she knew their time was short, their chances slim, and yet she felt no fear, only the clarity of purpose fulfilled, the knowledge that even if they did not leave these walls, the general's silence would echo louder than his words ever had. The dawn broke heavy with silence, the kind of silence that weighed on the skin and pressed into the bones. The camp stirred in uneasy fragments, soldiers moving like shadows with no rhythm, their eyes darting to the edges of the horizon as if the enemy might materialize at any heartbeat. She walked among them unnoticed, her boots crunching softly against the hardened earth, her uniform blending into the gray monotony of weary bodies and faded banners. Yet within her chest, a storm brewed with relentless force, the kind that could not be hidden much longer. She had already proved herself with the shot that silenced the general, but the army was not ready to embrace what it had seen. To them, she was still an anomaly, a mystery wrapped in the guise of an ordinary soldier. Her name was murmured in hushed tones, some calling her a savior, others cursing her as a disruptor who had broken the chain of command. But to her none of that mattered. The shot had not been for recognition, it had been for survival, for honor, for the chance to be heard when silence had smothered her existence for far too long. The general had not spoken to her since the day of that fateful shot. His silence echoed louder than any words could, a silence that carried both disbelief and grudging respect. He watched her from afar, his eyes narrowing whenever their paths crossed, as though he was trying to decode the puzzle of her existence. Why had she acted when others froze? Why had she carried precision in her hands like it was her birthright? She avoided his gaze whenever she could, not out of fear but out of defiance, refusing to bend or break under the scrutiny that sought to measure her worth. The other soldiers, however, were less restrained. Some glared with envy, whispering insults sharp enough to pierce skin. Others watched her with quiet awe, secretly grateful that in the darkest moment, it had been her bullet that found its mark when no one else dared to lift a rifle. Still, she kept her silence, moving through the camp like smoke, unseen yet undeniable. The night before their next march, the tension cracked like ice under weight. A group of soldiers cornered her near the mess tent, their faces flushed with anger and humiliation. They called her arrogant, accused her of making fools of them all, and one spat at her boots as though to strip away the dignity she had earned. She stood still, her eyes locked on theirs, unflinching, her silence more piercing than any retort. When the biggest of them shoved her shoulder, testing her strength, she did not fall. Instead, she raised her chin, her voice finally breaking the quiet like thunder across the plains. "I didn't take that shot to shame you," she said, her words low but heavy. "I took it because none of you did. If that wounds your pride, it is a wound you gave yourselves." Her defiance stunned them into silence, their rage deflating in the shadow of her truth. They left one by one, muttering under their breath, but she knew they would never forget the moment they had looked into her eyes and seen something stronger than their hate. The march began the following day, a column of weary bodies moving through scorched earth and abandoned villages. The land bore scars of endless battles, walls riddled with bullet holes, doors hanging from broken hinges, fields burned to ash. As she walked, she felt the weight of those ruins pressing into her chest, the reminder that every step forward carried echoes of countless lives shattered and lost. She tightened her grip on her rifle, not because she feared what lay ahead, but because she carried within her a promise she had made to herself long ago. She would not let her life fade into the obscurity of nameless soldiers, swallowed by the mud and smoke of war. She had already carved her mark, and she would carve it deeper if the world dared to ignore her. Each step forward was not just a march into battle, it was a march toward her destiny, a path she had chosen with her own blood and breath. On the third day of the march the enemy struck. Ambush fire tore through the ranks like lightning splitting a tree. Men fell, cries rising above the clash of metal and smoke. Chaos swallowed order in an instant, and once again the soldiers froze, their rifles hesitating, their eyes searching desperately for command. She did not wait. She dropped into cover, her body moving with instinct honed not by training but by the raw will to survive. Her rifle snapped against her shoulder, her fingers squeezing with ruthless precision. One shot, then another and another. Each bullet found its mark, each strike cutting through the advancing shadows. The general, watching from a distance, could not believe the clarity in her movements, the way she seemed to command the battlefield not with orders but with the sharp, unyielding language of survival. For the second time, she shifted the tide of a battle that had been seconds from collapse. For the second time, the soldiers looked at her not as one of them, but as something beyond them. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was reverent. The men who had spat at her boots now avoided her gaze, shame written across their faces. The ones who had whispered curses now whispered prayers, thanking fate for the unseen soldier who had stood between them and death. She cleaned her rifle slowly, deliberately, not acknowledging the stares, not soaking in the respect she had never sought. She was not here for them. She was here for something greater, something unspoken, something that lived in the marrow of her bones. But even she could not ignore the shift in the air, the quiet acknowledgement that her presence was no longer a shadow, it was a force that could not be denied. That night the general came to her. He stood outside her tent for a long time before speaking, his voice carrying the weight of years and the sting of pride. "You have done what my men could not," he said, his tone stripped of arrogance, bare with reluctant truth. She did not rise, did not salute, did not offer the deference expected of her. Instead, she looked at him steadily, her eyes calm and unwavering. "I did what I had to," she replied. "Not for you, not for them, for survival." The general studied her, his jaw tightening, his hands clasped behind his back. For the first time he did not see a faceless soldier in the crowd. He saw the fire that burned behind her silence, the storm that had lived unseen until the moment it unleashed itself on the world. He left without another word, but she knew the silence between them had changed forever. As the camp slept, she lay awake staring at the stars, her heart both heavy and alive. She thought of the lives she had taken, the blood that stained her hands, the weight of survival pressing down like an unrelenting tide. Yet she also thought of the moment when the general's voice had faltered, when his certainty had cracked under the force of her truth. She was no longer invisible, no longer unseen. But with that visibility came a burden heavier than anonymity had ever been. She was no longer just a soldier, she was a symbol, and symbols could never rest. As the night stretched on, she closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to gather the strength she would need for the battles still to come. For the war was far from over, and her story had only just begun. The following morning, the camp rose to the smell of ash and the ache of wounds that had not yet healed, both in body and in spirit. The soldiers moved slower than usual, their voices hushed, their glances darting toward her whenever they thought she would not notice. She did not speak, nor did she demand their acknowledgement, but she could feel the shift in the rhythm of the camp. Where once she had been ignored, now there was space carved around her, an unspoken recognition that she was no longer just one of them. The general's silence lingered still, but it was no longer the silence of doubt, it was the silence of contemplation, of a man wrestling with the truth he could not escape. She sat apart from the others, cleaning her rifle in steady motions, her mind not on their stairs but on the road ahead. Every battle felt heavier than the last, not just because of the lives taken, but because of the expectations that grew in the shadows of her actions. She had not asked to carry that weight, but it clung to her all the same. They marched again through forests darkened by smoke and hills scarred with trenches. Each step forward was met with the knowledge that death could wait behind any tree, that the enemy was never truly gone, only hiding, waiting for weakness. As the column stretched across the landscape, she remained near the front, her eyes scanning every ridge, every flicker of shadow, her body taut with readiness. The general rode close by, his gaze occasionally sweeping toward her as though her presence gave him a reassurance he could not admit. She noticed but never let her eyes linger, for trust was not something she offered freely, not even to the man who commanded them all. Instead, her trust lay in her own hands, in the steadiness of her breath and the strength of her resolve. Each step of the march felt like a heartbeat in the chest of a beast too large to control, but she walked with the calm of someone who had already faced the storm and survived. On the 5th day the column crested a ridge and saw the valley below burning. Villages had been torn apart, fields set ablaze, smoke rising like dark fingers clawing at the sky. The enemy had left nothing but ruin behind, a warning carved in flame for those who dared to follow. The men muttered curses under their breath, their fear growing louder than their footsteps. Some faltered, their bodies trembling under the weight of uncertainty. She, however, stepped forward, her jaw tightening, her eyes fixed not on the destruction but on the horizon beyond it. To her, the flames were not a warning, they were a challenge, a reminder that survival was forged not in the absence of fire but in walking through it. She did not speak, but the way she carried herself pulled the eyes of those around her, steadied their trembling, reminded them that fear could not break what determination refused to release. Without orders, without commands, she gave them something stronger than words, the example of endurance. That night, they made camp on the edge of the burning valley, the glow of fire painting the sky a sickly red. The general called his officers into a circle, maps spread across the dirt, voices low and urgent. She lingered at the edge of the firelight, listening without appearing to, her hands resting against her knees. The plan was bold but dangerous, a direct assault at dawn, pushing through the valley before the enemy could regroup. Many of the officers argued against it, fear evident in their tones, but the general remained unmoved. He spoke of necessity, of momentum, of the need to strike before despair rotted the bones of his men. Still, doubt hung in the air, thick and suffocating. When the circle broke apart, the officers drifting away with unease in their eyes, the general remained by the fire, staring into the flames. She stepped forward then, her shadow stretching into the light, her voice steady as she spoke for the first time in his presence since the night he had come to her tent. "If you lead them into that valley with hesitation, they will fall before the enemy does," she said. His eyes rose to meet hers, the weight of her words sinking deeper than the smoke around them. He did not argue. He simply nodded as though he knew she was right. The dawn came harsh and swift, the valley cloaked in smoke and ash. The soldiers tightened their grips on their rifles, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with the terror of what lay ahead. The general gave the order, his voice carrying across the ranks, but it was her presence that held them steady. She did not stand in front, nor did she shout commands, but the men's eyes found her all the same, as though her silence spoke louder than any speech could. When the first shots rang out, the valley erupted into chaos. Bullets tore through the air, explosions shook the earth, the smell of fire and blood mingling into something suffocating. Soldiers stumbled, cries filling the smoke, but she moved forward with precision, her rifle snapping to her shoulder, each shot finding its mark. She was not simply fighting, she was guiding, her calmness cutting through the storm, her resolve pulling others with her. Where she moved, men followed not because they were ordered to, but because they believed survival lived in her shadow. The battle stretched into hours, the valley becoming a graveyard of both courage and despair. The general fought alongside his men, his voice hoarse from shouting, his blade stained with blood, but even he could not deny where the true center of the fight lay. Again and again his eyes found her in the chaos, her figure cutting through the smoke, her shots saving men who would have fallen, her determination refusing to let the line break. And when at last the enemy faltered, retreating into the hills, it was her final bullet that struck the officer leading them, her shot echoing across the valley with the same weight it had carried when it silenced the general. The soldiers roared then, not for victory alone, but for the unseen soldier who had once walked among them in silence and now stood as the reason they still drew breath. When the valley finally fell quiet, the dead were gathered, the wounded tended to, the smoke still curling into the sky. She stood apart, her rifle resting in her hands, her body aching with exhaustion but her eyes steady. The men watched her, some approaching with words of gratitude they struggled to form, others simply bowing their heads in silent respect. She accepted none of it, offering only a nod before turning away. The general approached her, his face lined with the weight of battle, his eyes carrying something unspoken. He did not try to command her, did not try to claim her victory as his own. Instead he simply said, "Without you we would not have crossed this valley." She met his gaze, her voice low but firm. "Without survival there is no victory." He nodded once more, the silence between them now filled with acknowledgement instead of doubt. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, she sat by the edge of the valley, the stars above faint through the haze of smoke. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the release of all she had carried through the day. She thought of the faces she had saved, the ones she could not, the balance of survival tipping always between life and death. She thought of the moment when the enemy officer fell to her bullet, the sound of the shot echoing like a reminder that her path was no longer her own. She was no longer unseen, no longer hidden in the crowd. She had become the force the others looked to when the darkness grew too heavy. Yet in her heart she wondered if visibility was a blessing or a curse. For with every victory came the weight of expectation. And with every life saved came the knowledge that she could not save them all. She closed her eyes, her breath steady, her resolve unbroken. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another battle. And she would face it, not as a shadow, but as the soldier she had always been destined to become. The morning after the valley battle rose slowly, the sun bleeding through smoke-stained skies like a wounded eye opening. The camp was quiet, subdued by the weight of exhaustion, grief, and the fragile relief of survival. Soldiers moved carefully among the wounded, their boots dragging across the scorched ground, their faces etched with lines that would never fade. She walked through them like a ghost, silent, steady, her presence felt more than seen. No one tried to stop her now, no one dared question the steps she took or the choices she made. They had all witnessed what she was, what she carried in her hands, what she carried in her heart. Where once she had been just another nameless figure in the ranks, now she was something none of them could define, yet all of them understood. She had not sought their reverence, but it clung to her like the smoke still rising from the earth. The general called for her that afternoon. His tent was quieter than it had ever been, the maps rolled away, the candles burning low. When she entered, he did not sit behind his table with authority but stood waiting, his arms crossed, his expression grave. For a long moment he said nothing, only studied her with the kind of gaze that could strip away armor and pride alike. At last he spoke, his voice heavy but clear. "You have changed the course of this campaign," he said. "And yet you remain apart, as though you belonged to none of us." She met his eyes, unflinching, her voice calm. "I never belonged to you," she said. "I belonged to survival, to the silence that carried me when no one else would. You see me now because of what I've done, but I was always here, unseen in your ranks, invisible until the moment survival demanded otherwise." His jaw tightened, his silence once again filled with respect he could not put into words. He gave her a slow nod, as though surrendering to a truth greater than command. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the soldiers gathered around fires, their voices weaving through the night like threads of relief and sorrow. Some spoke of home, of faces waiting far away, of hopes fragile and desperate. Others fell silent, staring into the flames, haunted by the faces that would never return. She sat apart, her rifle across her knees, her hands steady even as her mind replayed every shot, every cry, every life taken or spared by a decision she could never undo. She did not cry. She had long since forgotten how. But deep within her, beneath the steel of resolve, something ached. A longing not for glory, not for recognition, but for peace. She wondered if such a thing would ever find her, or if her fate was to remain a soldier forever, seen now but never understood. The general approached her again, not as a commander but as a man carrying the burden of countless lives. He sat beside her without a word, the firelight flickering against the lines of his face. For a long time they listened to the crackle of the flames, the distant murmurs of men clinging to the illusion of safety. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "They look to you now. Even when they look to me, it is you they see behind my words. That is not something I can change." She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I never wanted them to look to me," she said. "I only wanted to survive, to keep walking when others fell." He nodded, his eyes lowering to the dirt. "That is why they follow you. Because you did not ask for it." The silence stretched, heavy yet strangely unburdened. For the first time she felt the distance between them narrowing, not as commander and soldier, but as two souls bound by the same endless war. When the next march began, the air carried something different, a weight that was not fear but anticipation. The soldiers moved with more steadiness now, their eyes sharper, their steps firmer. She walked among them, no longer unseen, yet she carried herself with the same silence, the same refusal to claim the mantle thrust upon her. The path ahead led not just to another battlefield, but to the heart of the war itself, where decisions would shape not only their lives but the future of everything they fought for. She felt the burden of it pressing into her shoulders, but she did not falter. Burdens were all she had ever carried, and she knew how to bear them. The general rode nearby, his eyes often seeking her, not to command but to anchor himself to the certainty she carried. For the first time their silences were not separate, they were shared. As days bled into nights, The war pressed harder, battles erupting with greater ferocity, losses cutting deeper into their ranks. Yet wherever the line wavered, she was there, her rifle speaking the language of defiance, her silence steadying the fear around her. Men who had once doubted her now fought harder because of her, their courage drawn from the strength she embodied. The general himself began to change, his voice less commanding, more grounding, as though he had finally learned that authority meant nothing without belief. The two of them, once divided by pride and invisibility, now stood as the twin pillars holding the army together. Still, she never let the recognition alter her. In her heart, she remained the same unseen soldier who had walked through smoke and mud, who had taken the shot no one else would. That truth was her anchor, her reminder that the weight she carried was not for glory but for survival. The final battle came on a plain littered with ruins, the sky black with smoke, the earth trembling beneath the march of thousands. It was a clash that swallowed the horizon, the roar of gunfire and screams rising like a storm no man or woman could contain. She fought at the front, her rifle steady, her body moving with the precision of someone who no longer questioned life or death but accepted both as companions. The general fought near her side, their movements unspoken but aligned, a rhythm carved through shared survival. When the tide threatened to break, it was her shot once again that turned the course, striking the enemy leader with the same finality that had silenced the general so long ago. The battlefield paused in that heartbeat, the sound of her bullet echoing across the chaos, and in that pause victory took root. When the dust settled, the enemy scattered, the plain fell quiet except for the cries of the wounded and the whispers of the living. She stood among the ruins, her rifle lowered, her breath steady though her body trembled with exhaustion. The soldiers looked to her, their eyes filled not with awe but with something deeper, gratitude, belief, the unshakable truth that without her, they would not stand where they stood. The general approached, his armor scarred, his face pale with fatigue. He did not speak at first, only bowed his head, a gesture more powerful than words. At last he said, "You were unseen once. Never again." She met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the weight of everything she had carried. "I was never unseen," she said quietly. "You just refused to see." That night, as the fires of victory burned and the soldiers celebrated survival, she walked away from the noise, finding solitude on a hill overlooking the battlefield. The stars were faint through the smoke, but she fixed her gaze on them, her breath slow, her heart heavy yet unbroken. She thought of the road that had brought her here, the silence that had defined her, the shot that had made her visible. She thought of the men who had doubted her, the general who had once ignored her, and the truth that had risen from it all. She had never needed their recognition. She had only needed to remain true to herself, to the survival that had carried her when all else failed. Now the war was not yet over, but she had become more than she had ever expected. She had become a voice of silence, a force unseen until the world had no choice but to witness it. And as she stood there, rifle in hand, eyes on the stars, she knew that whether in life or in memory, she would never fade into the crowd again. The end.